The rain came down in sheets that Tuesday afternoon, the kind of steady downpour that makes you grateful for a warm home and a dry place to rest your head. But Grace Mitchell had neither. At 23, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wearing a faded olive jacket over a cream-colored dress, Grace had been living in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town for 3 months. Life had dealt her some difficult cards. Her mother's medical bills had taken everything, and when her mother passed, Grace found herself alone in the world with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart that still believed in goodness. She didn't complain. That wasn't her way. Her mother had taught her better than that. On this particular rainy day, Grace was walking back to the warehouse when she heard it. A soft whimpering coming from beneath an overturned crate near the old factory building. She stopped and listened. There it was again. She knelt down in the rain, her jacket already soaked through, and carefully lifted the crate. A pair of bright blue eyes stared back at her. A Siberian husky puppy, no more than 4 months old, shivered in the mud. His white and gray fur was matted and dirty, and he looked up at her with such trust that it nearly broke her heart. "Oh, you poor thing," Grace whispered softly. "You're all alone too, aren't you?" She didn't think twice. She scooped up the trembling puppy and held him close against her chest, trying to share what little warmth she had. The puppy nuzzled into her jacket, his small body shaking. Grace hurried back to the warehouse. It wasn't much, but it was dry. She'd made a small corner into something almost comfortable, with cardboard for insulation and a few blankets she'd found at the donation center. She dried the puppy as best she could with her only towel, talking to him in soothing tones. "There now. You're safe. I don't have much, but I'll share what I have with you." She gave him the last of her bread, soaked in a little water, and watched as he ate hungrily. Then she wrapped him in her spare blanket and held him close. For the first time in months, Grace didn't feel quite so alone. She named him Scout. That night, as the rain drummed on the warehouse roof, Grace made a promise to the little dog sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I'll take care of you," she whispered. "We'll take care of each other." The next morning dawned clear and bright. Grace was washing Scout's fur as best she could with water from a nearby spigot when she heard a car pull up outside the warehouse. It was an expensive sound, the kind of engine that purrs rather than rumbles. A black SUV stopped near the entrance, and a man stepped out. He was tall, probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair neatly styled and wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit that probably cost more than Grace had earned in a year at her last job. He had the bearing of someone important, someone used to being in charge. But there was something in his face, something worried and weary. The little girl holding his hand was adorable, maybe 4 years old, with blonde hair adorned with pink flowers. She wore a sweet floral dress and had her father's earnest eyes. Grace stood up slowly, holding Scout, suddenly very aware of how she must look in her worn clothing and tangled hair. The man's eyes locked onto the puppy. His expression transformed instantly from worry to pure relief. "Apollo!" he called out. Scout's ears perked up at the name, and his tail began wagging furiously. The little girl squealed with delight. "Daddy, it's Apollo!" "The nice lady found him?" The man approached quickly. His polished shoes splashing through puddles he didn't seem to notice. When he was a few feet away, he stopped, really seeing Grace for the first time. She watched as his eyes took in her situation. The warehouse behind her, the makeshift shelter visible through the open door. His expression softened into something deeper than relief. Something like understanding. "I'm David Bennett," he said quietly, his voice gentle. "This is my daughter, Emma, that puppy, Apollo. He ran away from our home yesterday. We've been searching all night." Grace carefully handed the puppy to Emma, who clutched him with pure joy, covering his face with kisses. Apollo wiggled and licked her cheeks, clearly as happy to see her as she was to see him. "I found him under a crate in the rain," Grace explained. "He was cold and scared. I just wanted to make sure he was safe." David looked at her for a long moment. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pity, just genuine respect and something that looked like admiration. "You took care of him," he said simply. You kept him warm and fed him when you barely have anything for yourself. Grace felt her cheeks flush. Anyone would have done the same. No, David said softly. They wouldn't have. Not everyone. Emma tugged on her father's sleeve. Daddy, can the nice lady come have breakfast with us? She helped Apollo. David smiled at his daughter, then looked back at Grace. My daughter is wise beyond her years. Please, let us thank you properly. Just breakfast. No strings attached. You showed kindness to someone I love very much. Let me show you some kindness in return. Grace hesitated. Pride and hunger warred inside her. But there was something genuine in David's eyes, something sincere in Emma's smile. All right, she said quietly. Just breakfast. The restaurant David chose was warm and bright, with comfortable booths and the smell of coffee and fresh pastries. Grace tried not to feel self-conscious as the hostess seated them, though she noticed David say something to the woman that made her smile warmly at Grace. Over eggs and pancakes and more food than Grace had seen in weeks, David told her his story. I started my company 10 years ago, he said, watching Emma color on her kid's menu. Bennett Technologies. We developed software for hospitals. I was lucky, worked hard, and things grew faster than I ever imagined. He paused, his expression growing sad. My wife, Emma's mother, passed away 2 years ago. Cancer. It was the hardest thing we've ever been through. I'm so sorry, Grace said softly, and she meant it. She understood that kind of loss. David nodded. Emma was only 2. She stopped talking for months. Nothing I did seemed to help. Then one day I brought home Apollo, just a puppy then, and Emma smiled for the first time since her mother died. That dog gave her back her voice, her joy. He looked at Grace with sincere gratitude. When he ran away yesterday, I thought I might lose her all over again. But you saved him. You saved them both, really? Grace shook her head. I just did what anyone with a heart would do. That's where you're wrong, David said gently. You had every reason to focus only on your own survival. But you chose kindness instead. That says everything about who you are. Over breakfast, Grace found herself telling her own story. About her mother's illness, the medical debt, losing their home. About trying to find work but having no address to put on applications, no phone for callbacks. About how easy it is to become invisible in a world that moves so fast. David listened. Really listened. And so did Emma, in her innocent 4-year-old way. When breakfast was finished, David asked carefully, Do you have a safe place to stay tonight? Grace hesitated, then decided on honesty. The warehouse isn't so bad. I've got blankets. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I have a guest house. On my property. It's small, but it's warm and dry and empty. I'd like you to stay there, just until you get back on your feet. No strings attached. Grace's eyes filled with tears. I can't accept that. I'm not a charity case. I know you're not, David said earnestly. But I'm a father and I'm thinking about my daughter. I want her to grow up in a world where kindness is rewarded, not punished. Where doing the right thing leads to good things. If you won't accept for yourself, accept for Emma. Show her that good people are taken care of. Emma reached across the table and put her small hand on Grace's. Please, she said with her sweet voice. You're Apollo's friend. That makes you our friend too. How could anyone say no to that? The guest house was like something from a dream. Small but perfectly appointed, with a real bed and clean sheets, a kitchenette, and a bathroom with a shower that had hot water. Grace stood in the doorway and cried. David gave her space but made sure she had everything she needed. Groceries appeared in the small refrigerator. Clean clothes, simple but nice, showed up in her size. But more than the material things, David offered her respect. I have an opening in my company, he mentioned a few days later. Administrative assistant position. It doesn't require a degree, just someone organized and reliable. Someone with integrity. I think you'd be perfect for it. Grace took the job. She worked hard, arriving early and staying late, determined to prove herself. She was good at it too. The other employees liked her warmth and efficiency. She had a natural way of making people feel heard and valued. In the evenings, she'd often join David and Emma for dinner. Not every night, but enough that it began to feel like something more than just gratitude. Like friendship. Like family, Emma adored Grace, and the feeling was mutual. Grace taught her to braid hair and told her stories. Grace helped with homework and tea parties with stuffed animals. Apollo, of course, was always part of the fun, having appointed himself Grace's personal shadow. David and Grace would talk late into the evening sometimes, after Emma was in bed, about loss and hope, about how life can break your heart, but also surprise you with unexpected blessings, about how the worst moments can lead to the best connections. I thought I'd never feel whole again after my wife died, David confessed one evening as they sat on his porch watching the sunset. I thought the best I could hope for was to get through each day for Emma's sake. He looked at Grace with an expression she was beginning to recognize. But you've reminded me that there's still beauty in the world. Still goodness. You've brought light back into this house? Grace felt her heart flutter. You gave me back my life when I'd almost given up hope. You saw me when I felt invisible. How could anyone not see you? David said softly. 6 months passed like a gentle dream. Grace excelled at her job and got a promotion. She moved from the guest house into a small apartment in town, though she was at David's house almost every day anyway. Emma started calling her Miss Grace, with such affection that it made Grace's heart soar. One evening, David invited Grace to dinner at a fancy restaurant downtown. Emma was with David's mother for the night, and Grace realized this was different. This was a date. Over candlelight and wine, David took her hand. I've been thinking a lot about fate, he said, about how one rainy day can change everything, about how the worst storms can bring the greatest blessings. Grace smiled. I've been thinking about that too. I never thought I'd feel this way again, David continued. After losing my wife, I thought that chapter of my life was closed. But Grace, you've opened my heart again, not to replace what I had, but to discover something new, something beautiful. He paused, then said simply, I'm falling in love with you. Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks. Happy tears? I'm falling in love with you too. They were married the following spring in a small ceremony in David's garden. Emma was the flower girl, of course, wearing her favorite dress and carrying a basket of rose petals. Apollo wore a bow tie and walked Emma down the aisle, making everyone laugh and cry at the same time. Grace's wedding dress was simple and elegant, and as she walked toward David, she remembered that rainy day when she had nothing. She remembered the frightened puppy under the crate and the choice she'd made to help despite having so little. She thought about how one act of kindness can ripple outward in ways you never imagine. How saving a lost dog in the rain had somehow saved her, too. That evening, as they danced under string lights with their family and friends around them, David whispered in her ear, Thank you for saving Apollo that day. Grace smiled and held him close. Thank you for seeing me. How could I not? He said again. You shine like a beacon, Grace. You always have. Years later, Grace would tell this story to anyone who needed to hear it. To people struggling, people who felt invisible, people who wondered if kindness still mattered in this harsh world. She'd tell them about a rainy day and a lost puppy, about choosing compassion when she had every reason not to, about how the smallest acts of goodness can lead to the greatest blessings. And she'd remind them that sometimes, when you save someone else, you end up saving yourself. Because that's what love does. That's what kindness does. It multiplies, it grows. It transforms ordinary rainy days into the beginning of everything beautiful. And it all started with a girl, a dog, and the simple choice to be kind.